And because of that, the popes, and popes at various times, became allies of Cluny. And other popes, of course, were not because of the reform aspect. In many respects, Cluny had significant impact, not only on the monastic life of the church, but also on the religious life of the general church in a couple of ways. First was through the enactment of various means of reform. Cluny monks, several of them became bishops, popes, and through that were able to bring about reforms to the church at large. The Cluny monks were also important through the promotion of ideals like the peace of God and the truth of God. Now, others had developed these ideas, but essentially Cluny popularized them so that they became a part of the thinking of Western Europe at the time. The peace of God referred to the protection of non-combatants who could not defend themselves during times of warfare. Virgin women, widows, children. These were not, it's an effort to try and protect them from violence. It also enacted the protection of church buildings, church leaders. Anyone that robbed a church or peasants or attacked priests was to be excommunicated. Now, they could make reparations to avoid the excommunication, but it was to be something very serious enough that we would try to avoid these things. Later, merchants and goods were added to the list of who was protected. There was wide acceptance by the crowds of these things. In addition, the peace of God also prohibited fighting on Sundays as well as certain feast days. The truce of God was similar but different as well. Essentially, the truce of God involved temporary cessation of fighting during private armed conflicts. This is not about like a just war called by a leader. This is about violence enacted in other ways. Essentially, the truce of God protected certain classes during certain seasons of the year. That expanded throughout the years that it was developed, where it left about 80 days during a year when private warfare could take place, and not consecutive days, just like you could only engage in warfare at certain times. Cluny was also important because of the developing issue of clerical celibacy. It is in this time that it is, finally made a requirement of everybody. It had kind of gone back and forth. There were certainly priests who had been married prior to this, but finally, in the later Middle Ages, it was made an absolute for Catholic priests. Essentially, within all of that is concern for the purity of the church, and concerns that church lands would be inherited by descendants of priests, bishops, instead of staying with the church. And then Cluny was also important because of its efforts against simony, right, and trying to expand the definition of what constitutes simony, and also trying to condemn it. As I mentioned previously, the reforms in the monasteries often spilled over into the rest of the world. And we can see some of that through the reforms of Bruno of Toul, who will be elected pope and take the papal name Leo IX. Bruno was born to a noble family. His father was cousin to the emperor, and as part of his early life was educated in the city of Toul, where he would eventually become bishop. As bishop, he would serve both the Emperor Conrad II as well as the Emperor Henry III. He is very interested in reform, especially reforming church leadership away from secular rulers. A lot of the things that he wants to see are things that we've already talked about, right? An end to simony, clerical celibacy, and it's Bruno, it's Leo, that wants to really get rid of that, make that universal. He becomes Pope Leo IX after the death of Damasus II and pushed other reforms as well. Things like requiring monks to be obedient to the Benedictine rule and to be obedient to the Pope. Furthermore, he pushed for the poverty of monks. For Leo, good monks shouldn't own anything, and they should give up all of their possessions when they become a monk. The monasteries themselves shouldn't be wealthy either, since through cultivating the land, through people that would be connected to the monastery, either from noble classes or families of noble classes, it would be easy for a monastery to gain wealth, and so Leo wants to try and stop that. Not only does he want to stop it in the monasteries, he wants to stop it among the bishops as well. The bishops, for him, are living such luxurious lives because, again, of the wealth that they would accumulate because of the lands that they would control. Ideally for Leo, wealth was to be used for the poor. Not surprisingly, the common people supported a lot of Leo's reforms. In some places, like the city of Rome, he has some success pretty quickly in reform. Other places, it's a gradual thing. Works pretty well in Germany at the time. Slow start in France. They're not immediately on board. Later on, he will decide to try and attack the Normans. Again, those descendants of the Norsemen, the Vikings, who have landed in southern Italy. And in that, he will actually be held hostage for a while. He was captured and held hostage. He will also strain relationships with the East, including what's known as the Great East-West Schism that we'll talk about next week, where he excommunicates the Patriarch of Constantinople. Reform throughout the later Middle Ages, however, was never a very long-lasting time in the grand scheme of things. It might be a century or so, but eventually all of these reforms began to deteriorate. By the 12th century, many felt that Cluny and others had compromised their ideals and had gained too much wealth. Monasteries tended to attract others. I believe we mentioned this before, where other people who are not interested in becoming a monk or nun are interested in living by monks and nuns because of the idea that we're spiritually close to these people who are held up in high esteem, so maybe some of that will be effective on us. Maybe they felt they could do religious duties by being close where they could support the life of the monastery. And so these monasteries, which would sometimes be set up in these very secluded places, over time would gather people around them, and villages and towns would develop, which would lead to the overall wealth of the area. Furthermore, as these towns and things developed, the monks became more and more involved in society. And we're talking about a time where capitalism is developing, urbanism is developing, and it leads monks to a choice. Do you remain connected to society and its allure, or do you now essentially pick up and move again? And move to some place that will be separated. Now, there are some who decide to return to the separate lifestyle. Often what happens is the very same thing. Maybe during their life or their generation, there is that separateness, but a generation 2, 3 down the road, same kind of thing happens. And so we see another group of monks, this time at a monastery in the city of Citeaux in France, take up the call of reform again. The Latin for the place is known as, or translates into Cistercians. And so it's the monastery at Citeaux. The monks are known as Cistercian monks. A Benedictine abbot named Robert becomes convinced that the Cluniac communities have given up the rigor of the Benedictine rule, the simplicity of life that was encouraged under it. And so he decides to start a new monastery in Citeaux. They begin building buildings, they begin to farm the land, but Robert is ordered to go back to where he had been the abbot, region known as Burgundy. And so, essentially, what had happened was after he had left, the monastery had declined, and so he's ordered to go back and fix it. So the monks at Citeaux choose a new abbot, who brings other types of reform as well, changes the color of the clothes the monks will wear. Benedictine monks wore black. The Cistercian monks adopt white. He will return the focus to manual work and prayer instead of allowing others to be taking care of the manual work like it happened with Cluny. Just one last thing with the black and white. The white was considered to be a simpler color because the black would have had to have been dyed. Right? Wool would have had to have been dyed black in many cases. And so white was considered to be more simpler because it was wool that had nothing had been done to it. The third abbot was a man named Stephen Harding, who was from a noble family. And he decides that what is needed is a guiding document. And so he creates a document called the Charter of Love or the Charter of Charity that is going to guide these monks. Daughter houses develop as well that are largely independent, but they also have a centralized body of leaders that oversees the order. The Cistercians rejected luxuries, wealth, at least in those early years. There were to be no silver or gold crosses. Any crosses were to be wood. They also worked about simplifying the liturgy. That way it would shorten the amount of time so that the monks could spend time in contemplation. And so it's about the simplification is so they could spend more time thinking about, meditating about God and Scripture. Ultimately, the Cistercians tried to develop a lifestyle that was self-sufficient. They tried to refuse any sort of wealth and entanglement with courts, other aspects of society, develop plain buildings. And for the monks, they were only allowed what was absolutely necessary with respect to food, clothing, rest. And the idea was that each monastery was to be self-sufficient. They were not to depend on outsiders for any help. The Cistercians grew rapidly. Often, as before other monasteries, they built in secluded areas, and the order spread throughout Western Europe, into places like Germany, Italy, into Eastern Europe, like places like Poland, north to places like Norway, and even into Spain and Portugal. The Cistercian order began declining in the 1200s, right? Started in the 1100s, began declining in the late 1200s as mendicant orders developed. Mendicant orders refer to monks who would travel instead of being located in a specific house. We'll talk about some of them next week. Other things led to the decline as well. Relaxation of the rules in Cistercian monasteries. They're farming, they get wealth too. Right? It's the same kind of thing. Right? They start out rejecting all of this. We're going to do this on our own. You get to a point, though, you're making too much food for yourself. What do you do with it? Eventually, wealth starts to come. Those monks as well gradually moved away from manual labor like the Cluniac monks had. There are still some Cistercian monasteries around, though, even today. So it does maintain some of its existence. Any questions about the monastic reforms? Any of those that we've covered?
How are they interacting with monasteries? Are still acting as places of education for villages around themselves? They're still trying to provide stability for the people.
Some of them were. I mean, some of them said we're going to just completely leave society, we get away from that, and then others are saying, that's one of our responsibilities.
what really determined whether or not they were going to be completely separated or trying to integrate in society?
The early leadership, right, and how they interpreted the Benedictine rule. And it seems like most of them, as they start out with the view of we need to be separate, and then gradually get into this position of being involved with society. Other questions about reform? Again, even though we talk about the Reformation as this great period out here in the 1500s, there were efforts at reform in many of these cases. However, one of the big differences is that a lot of these reforms tended to be more focused on morality and religious practice, whereas major reforms of the Reformation period will be doctrinal. And there's some issues related to practice as well, but it's not as much about the morality, it's not as much about like developing a life of simplicity, etc. It's more about some specific doctrines of the church in the 1500s.